Today our subject is Chapter 13, the peripheral nervous system, in our Human Anatomy and Physiology text. In Part 1 we looked at the sensory receptors, and now we're going to take a look at sensory integration, making sense of the stimuli that are impacting our body, as well as some aspects of pain sensation and pain management. So sensory integration, putting together all the data coming in from our sensory receptors and then processing it in such a way that you can perceive the importance of it, the meaning of it. We'll look at three different sort of levels of integration. The very initial level is when the sensory receptors themselves are activated, then the pathways which carry impulses to the cortex, and then association. Here's a little schematic diagram showing some sensory receptors of different types. Somatic sensory receptors carry information from the unipolar sensory neurons to the spinal cord to the thalamus, and thalamus to the cortex. Notice that collaterals, axon collaterals, or branches of these sensory neurons, synapse in the reticular formation. Because remember, the reticular activating system gets collaterals or branches from axons of all the sensory neurons, so that the more sensory inputs there are, the more the reticular activating system will light up or activate or turn up the activity of the entire cortex. It's pretty cool stuff. All right, another thing I like about this drawing, it shows some proprioceptors here, muscle spindles and joint kinesthetic receptors, which may be anything from Ruffini's endings to free nerve endings to Pacinian corpuscles, as well as Golgi tendon organs. And those receptors report to the cerebellum, which keeps track of all that musculoskeletal information so that the premotor cortex can have some assistance in fine-tuning motor plans. So first of all, the receptor level of integration. The nature of the stimulus can largely be inferred from which sensory neurons are active. Each type of stimulus is transduced by a specific type of sensory neuron. In other words, pressure and vibration may be sensed especially by Ruffini's endings and Pacinian corpuscles. Light touch by hair follicle receptors and Meissner's corpuscles. Cold and hot changes in temperature by specific thermoreceptors, and so forth. So just looking at the array of receptors that are firing tells us quite a bit about the type of stimulus that's present. The receptive field. How many sensory receptors on the surface of the body, for example, are being activated? Is it just a couple of receptors in one little area, or is there a large swath of the surface being impacted by the stimulus? Also helps give us some information we can use to sort of figure out, perceive what's out there. Transduction is the name of the process of converting stimulus energy into action potentials by sensory neurons. Right? So every sensory neuron, whatever stimulus it's designed to transduce, that stimulus causes depolarization of the dendrites. That's called a generator potential. Remember that dendrites and cell bodies of sensory neuron, or any neuron, have graded depolarization. It can be any amount of depolarization. If it's in a synaptic situation, it would depend on how much neurotransmitter is released and how many channels have been opened. In the case of a sensory neuron, it depends on how big the stimulus is. How much is it depolarizing the membrane? So that's just called a generator potential in a sensory neuron, even though it's the same as a graded depolarization on any neuron. So if it reaches threshold, we'll have an action potential, or typically a series of action potentials, and the larger the stimulus, the higher the frequency of action potentials. Also, certain receptors are fast adapting and some aren't, and just the degree of adaptation tells us something about the location and type of stimulus that we're responding to. So again, a generator potential is just a graded depolarization on a sensory neuron, and if it reaches threshold, we'll have action potentials, usually again more than one, traveling down the axon of that unipolar neuron. How about the circuit level? That's talking about the pathways, the ascending pathways from the sensory neuron to the cortex. So 3 neurons in an ascending pathway. Unipolar sensory neurons have the receivers, the dendrites, that can transduce the stimuli. They carry impulses to the central nervous system and synapse in the spinal cord. And then from there, second-order sensory neurons carry the impulses up the spinal cord to the thalamus. And the thalamus, of course, is that switchboard, that relay station for incoming sensory information. And then third-order sensory neurons carry impulses from the thalamus up to the cortex, finally. So here's a picture that we had from the end of chapter 12, showing us an ascending pathway. We can see a sensory receptor in the plantar surface, a unipolar neuron. There's its little cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. Synapses in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord gray matter, with a second-order sensory neuron. That little dot is the cell body of the second-order neuron. The axon crosses over to the contralateral side of the spinal cord and then ascends in a white matter column or tract to the thalamus, and then a third-order sensory neuron synapses there and forms and carries the impulses to the cortex, the cerebral cortex. And then we begin to process at the perceptual level. So this diagram again shows us our pathway. Receptors, unipolar neurons, synapse in the spinal cord, they neglected to put those in there. Second-order sensory neurons carry impulses to the thalamus, and then third-order sensory neurons from the thalamus to the cortex. Interpretation, or association, the perceptual level, understanding the meaning and significance of the stimuli. So once we get the information coming into the primary somatosensory cortex, for example, we can make sense of it by associating or comparing it with memories in the association cortex. That's true for any of the sensory inputs. Some aspects of that process involve perceptual detection, just having the stimulus, having the impulses coming in, being aware of the stimulus and the receptor level aspects of it, which receptors are activated. Magnitude estimation has to do with the frequency of impulses. The bigger the stimulus, the higher the frequency. Now we know that this is a big deal or a very light, gentle stimulus. Spatial discrimination refers to how much of the body's surface area is being impacted, how many receptors are being impacted by the stimulus, and also being aware of where in the body is this happening. In the fingertips and hairless skin, for example, there's very, very dense packing of sensory receptors. We have great fine discrimination, it's called, between the positions of various stimuli, versus in some parts of your body the sensory receptors are very greatly spread out and you don't have as much spatial discrimination. But it tells us a lot about the stimulus. If we have a lot of spatial discrimination, we can do things like feature abstraction. Think about reaching into a bag or into your pocket with a lot of objects and trying to just find something among all those objects. We're going to be looking for particular properties of the stimulus, of the object, whether it's the surface texture, whether it's made of metal, is it cold feeling or warm, extra warm, or is it plastic, which has no particular temperature associated with it typically. All kinds of features of the object. Quality discrimination just refers to more complex aspects of association and perception. The special senses, for example, of taste and olfaction are given as an example here. Pattern recognition, listening to sounds and identifying melodies or various musical genres, for example. All these different things are aspects, sort of rising abstract levels of sensory perception. Don't need to worry about like memorizing these terms. I just want you to be thinking about all the different things that may be happening as you're perceiving the nature of a stimulus by association, by all those different means. Next section we'll quickly just talk about a little bit about the perception of pain. There are certain neurons whose job it is to report pain signals. Nociceptors. What kind of stimuli activate nociceptors? Things like histamine. If there's been some kind of a trauma, histamine is the inflammatory mediator released from mast cells, for example. So now we know that something's going on that we should be aware of, possibly an injury, and so histamine activates nociceptors. Extreme levels of changes in any sensory range of a sensory neuron can cause a pain sensation. High and low, extremely high and low temperatures. Sometime think about or experiment with your skin. Remind yourself about the fact that a very, very cold surface that you touch may cause the same exact burning sensation that a very hot surface that you touch might. So just a pain sensation coming from those overstimulated temperature receptors. Of intracellular compounds, ATP is normally found in the cytoplasm of cells. If cells become torn open, then we may have intracellular compounds leaking out into the surrounding area and activating nociceptors, right? Tissue injury, cells are being killed, and we have a pain sensation. Potassium is found largely in the cytoplasm of cells, very low concentration in the extracellular fluid, so if a lot of potassium comes out, they activate receptors. And bradykinin, various kinins are inflammatory mediators that are created during traumatic injuries or other kinds of inflammatory events and cause pain. The pathways, the ascending pathways of pain transmission often involve substance P as the neurotransmitter. So an ascending neuron might release substance P, which activates that second order sensory neuron, and that ascends up to the thalamus to begin to alert us to the location of a pain in our body. These are non-adapting receptors, as we said. However, the ascending neurons can be inhibited. There are neurotransmitters released at axo-axonal synapses that will inhibit action potential transmission in the ascending pain pathway. So we have pain signals coming in, right? And another neuron might be sent from above, from the brain down through the spinal cord to release some endorphins or enkephalins that may inhibit to some degree that pain sensation. So, right, the first thing that happens when you have an injury to your body, you have an extreme sense of pain, and you may actually even feel like it's an overwhelming sense of pain, but relatively soon, unless it's a very serious trauma, relatively soon the pain may diminish somewhat as you begin to inhibit the ascending pain pathway signals using these endogenous, they're called endogenous, means from within your body, or the naturally occurring opioids. Opioids are compounds that activate a family of receptors for these endorphins and enkephalins, opiate receptors specifically. Well, everyone has the same nociceptors and the same ascending pathways, the same ability to manage the incoming traffic of impulses on those pathways. But the thing is, people have very different tolerance for the pain signals. Some people can compartmentalize that pain experience, kind of quote-unquote shut it out of their conscious state and carry on with various activities and so forth. Yes, they're aware of it, but they're able to just carry on and do other things, focus on other things, whereas other people are absolutely not. The perception of the pain just occupies their entire conscious state, and they just can't do anything. They can't function. They're really debilitated by the sensation of pain. Same pain stimulus, perhaps. And that's just a built-in property of different people, the way they're wired, and it's important to recognize that because it's very easy to be insensitive or harsh with people who have low pain tolerance because they seem to be in some way flawed or not having enough backbone or fiber to be able to just suck it up and take a pill and deal with it, quote unquote, and deal with the pain, whereas other people can, and it's not their fault. It's just how they are, and we should recognize that. It's not that they want to have this overwhelming consciousness sort of flooding experience of the pain signal. It's a genetic condition. Well, signaling in pain pathways can produce an effect akin to what happens when you form long-term memories. We talked about synaptic potentiation, physical changes that take place in synapses when they're repetitively fired, that leads to permanent physical changes, making the synapses more sensitive, more easily activated. And something similar happens in pain pathways, such that if we allow them to signal pain for a long period of time, they may become super sensitized, almost as though they're hyperreactive. That's called hyperalgesia. The slightest sensation after that will produce a disproportionate sensation of pain. So it's important not to let that happen, right? One of the big part of medical care, especially in traumatic injury management, is to treat pain aggressively, because we don't want to allow the pain pathways to be activated over long periods of time, leading to hyperalgesia. People experiencing pain for months, years, or even for a lifetime after an injury has already been managed and ameliorated. So that's why we're so aggressive about treating pain. An interesting example shown here at the bottom. You could actually even have a hyperalgesia pain signal, pain sensation in part of your body that's no longer present due to some trauma or surgery. All it is, your somatosensory cortex just knows that when certain neurons are active, must be coming from that part of the body. So if you have a hyperalgesia pathway that's activated, you'll still keep receiving those pain sensations. Anyway, so we're aggressive about treating pain. We use drugs that are acting like these natural occurring opiate receptors activators. So we have drugs that can mimic endorphins and enkephalins by activating the opiate receptors and blocking those ascending pain pathways. Very powerful ones, in fact, much more powerful. Morphine is a drug that's been used for generations for activating opiate receptors and blocking transmission of pain pathways. Even much more powerful derivatives of opium or opium-like drugs have been developed, right? Oxycodone, hydroxycodone, hydrocodone. I meant to say, yeah, you've heard of those drugs, and they're a big problem because they were good drugs. Nowadays, they get such a bad rap that you think, like, wow, no one should have ever even invented those things. What a bunch of criminals. We intentionally want to treat pain aggressively to alleviate suffering over the longer term in people, but the problem is so many people have been exposed to these very, very powerful opiate receptor activators and become addicted that their lives have been ruined in some cases. And in fact, many, many overdoses occur and deaths due to opioid addiction, I should say. Opioids are the chemicals that activate the opiate receptors. Referred pain is an interesting thing. Our visceral sensory receptors can speak to the central nervous system about things happening in our digestive tract, for example. But if there's things going wrong in there, there's also some kind of something akin to pain sensation in the visceral organs. But again, those are not somatic sensors. But if things get bad in there, or very high intensity, very high frequency action potential traffic coming through some visceral receptors, it'll kind of bleed over into pain pathways. There are synapses of axon collaterals of visceral sensory neurons that then synapse with ascending somatic sensory neurons, and if the signals are great enough, it'll start producing action potentials in those somatic fibers, and we'll feel something. But interestingly, it won't be necessarily very related to the origin of the actual signal. So for example, I like this example. Someone may have hepatitis, inflammation in the liver. Some pain might be perceived in the area of the liver, but also some sensation may be perceived on the shoulder just because of the way the visceral receptors in the liver tend to bleed over into the somatic division. And so that's called referred pain. We feel the pain, we sense the pain, but it's not because of that's not the actual origin of the stimulus. Another classic one, when people have a heart attack, you've probably heard the description of the sensation as of pain shooting down the inside of the left arm, a crushing pain in the chest, and then pain shooting down the left arm. So that's referred pain associated with ischemia and injury in the heart. So that's just an interesting thing. The more you learn about referred pain, the more you can use your patient history to begin to and diagnose possible internal problems. Here's a little anatomic representation of a nerve. We said that axons in the central nervous system travel in what are called tracts, or the tissue type is called white matter. Tracts of axons, or even columns of axons in the spinal cord. Well, In the peripheral nervous system, axons travel in nerves. They're much too delicate to be free in the body. They would probably be pummeled and damaged by the various activities and movements and various mechanical stimulation. So each axon is instead wrapped up in a little protective connective tissue sheath called the endoneurium. And then bundles of axons are wrapped up in another layer of connective tissue protective covering called the perineurium. And the entire nerve, a number of different fascicles or bundles, are packaged up in a tough exterior fibrous connective tissue covering called the epineurium. Hopefully that will sound very familiar, as number one, we looked at this in lab, but also because of the naming scheme for these different levels of protective coverings mirrors what we learned about skeletal muscles, and the endomysium, the paramysium, and epimysium skeletal muscles. All right, join me for part 3 of chapter 13 as we look at the cranial nerves and the peripheral nerves of this part of the nervous system.